Anyone who's watched Vikings noticed the distinct hairstyles with the ponytail and undercut for men and elaborate hairstyles for women, raising a lot of questions and eyebrows about their authenticity. Overall, there's a huge mix of fantasy and some historical bits, but nothing of their looks really shouts Viking. So what do we actually know about hair, and what does that tell us about Vikings? Let's find out. Not that many descriptions of appearance, let alone hairstyles from this particular age. However, we do have some references to washing hair, for example, in Arab sources, while handsome men coming from Scandinavia are described as being a little bit too attractive for Anglo-Saxon women. So from what we do have, we can certainly deduce that cleanliness and grooming played a major part in Viking culture. By the way, when I'm saying Viking, I'm roughly referring to the developments in Scandinavia and where Scandinavians traveled in the 9th to 11th century. Perhaps personal care is more interesting because this would involve ways of marking your identity, in-group, out-group relations, markers of status, and so on. One clue comes from Alcuin of York, who, after the attack on Lindisfarne in the 8th century, wrote quite an angry letter to Ethelred, where he essentially blames the English and interprets the pagan attacks as divine punishment. Consider the dress, the way of wearing the hair, the luxurious habits of the princes and people. Look at your trimming of beard and hair, in which you have wished to resemble the pagans. Are you not menaced by terror of them whose fashion you wish to follow? What also of the immoderate use of clothing beyond the needs of human nature, beyond the custom of our predecessors? End of quote. There is also an interesting letter written by the 10th century English abbot Elfric of Eynsham. Quote, I say likewise to you, brother Edward, that you do unrightly when you forsake the English customs which our fathers held, and hold dear the customs of heathen men, and by that make manifest that you scorn our kind and our forefathers with that evil practice by which you, to their shame, dress yourself in Danish fashion with bald neck and blinded eyes. End of quote. The text actually uses the Old English verb to blind, ablendan, and the long bangs hanging onto the foreheads and perhaps impeding the vision of certain warriors might explain the blinded eyes, which is something you can also see on the 11th century Bayeux tapestry. Another option for this blinding hinge links us to what an author was writing in the later 10th century about the town of Hedeby, Shalashweek in Arabic, probably butchered it. But anyway, Ibrahim ibn Yaqub al-Israeli al-Tartushi was a native of the Cordoban city of Tortosa, and he visited Schleswig, essentially, so Hedeby, the older Danish town, and he noted that both women and men used a kind of cosmetic to enhance the beauty of their eyes. So he describes the Danes at Hedeby as lining their eyes with most likely kohl, a cosmetic widely used in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and so on and so forth, pinpointing the amount of networking these people actually were engaged in at the time. And then we also have the account of the treaty signing between the Byzantine Empire and the Viking Rus of Kiev. Leo the Deacon describes here Sviatoslav, the notorious Sviatoslav by his Norse names Sveinald, Prince of the Rus, as having shaved his head completely except for a lock of hair on one side, denoting his rank. But then again, we're talking about a different space here, so Eastern fashion might have been different than the Western one, and so on. Now, we do have these vague texts, but we also have some iconography. While art is usually highly stylized and idealized, maybe we could catch a glimpse about potential trends. There is, for example, the very well preserved decorative carving found etched into the hull of the Oseberg, the famous Viking ship in Norway, thought to have been buried around the year 834. As you can see here, the left figure is well worn, and the central figure facing left has a visibly shaved head with the top kept longer above the level of his ears. And if you look at the rightmost figure of the three, this one has his hair kept similar to the central figure, but with knotted rows being depicted, all knotted together at the back. The Bayeux tapestry could also be a source. This one tells the epic story in wool thread embroidered on linen cloth of William, Duke of Normandy, who became King of England in 1066 after the Battle of Hastings, and it provides a lot of information about civil and military architecture, castle mounds and armor with nasal helmets and oblong shields, seafaring in the Viking tradition, and so on. Through the great number of items depicted, it also gives precious details of the everyday life in the 11th century. It was probably commissioned by Bishop Odo of Bayeux, a cousin of William. We can see here the Norman style with the undercut and short hair, but whether this is the same as Elfric was describing, we can rather speculate here, because we are dealing here with Normans, so in the later Viking Age, and we're also dealing with a different geographic area. So all in all, I would say that Viking hairstyles varied from short hair to long braided hair, sometimes included shaved on the one side and possibly even bangs over their eyes. But we are talking about nearly 300 years of Viking Age history, including literally hundreds of Vikings who were possibly influenced by the hundreds of other people they eventually came in contact with and blended with. So it's impossible to say that there was only one or two or three specific Viking hairstyles. And regarding the iconographic sources, we also have a huge identification problem. We have the statuettes, for example, which most likely depicted some gods because you could have worn them as pendants, but then again, we can never be sure. For example, here, this is the statuette of Revninge, and although the figurine's hair is gathered in a bun and not the more typical knot, the swept-back style points to it being a goddess, but in the same time, it could also be a male deity. In particular, the trefoil brooch at the waist and the position of the hands would tend to suggest that. This type of brooch is derived from the design of the Frankish sword. In Scandinavia, it was reworked into female jewelry. So most likely it was a female, but then again, we cannot exclude the possibility that we're also dealing with a male figure or an androgynous one. Why not? In this figure, for example, we have the woman's hair, which is often long and tied up in a bun at the back of the head. As you can see here, this is more clearly a woman, also because she's carrying a drink, which is something very typical to see in this kind of source. But mind you that the poem Rikstula, for example, as well as other sources, do mention that both the upper class and, let's say, the land-owning farmers, so Jarl and Karl, women were wearing headdresses or bonnets very often. And we do have some archaeological records as well. Such bonnets have survived in Jorvik, in York, for example. And we also have in Dublin some examples. Here, the examples are in a more angular style, but at any rate, these headdresses were commonly made of linen, perhaps also of wool in the colder months. Here, a pair of archaeological discoveries speak volumes about this whole networking story, because we have a finely made woman's cap from Viking Age York and another one from Lincoln in the Viking-occupied Danelaw of England, which were produced from the same bolt of silk, and this silk had come all the way from the Far East. One of my favorite representations is this one here, the so-called Valkyria from Horby. It's a thumb-sized figurine made of gilded silver with some black and yellow inlaid decoration. The Valkyria is sturdily dressed, as you can see, armed with a double-sided Viking sword and a round shield, with her hair twisted into a long ponytail forming a loop. Here you can see another figurine from Öland. It is again certainly correct to assume some supernatural being because of the amuletic character of the object, but doubts can be raised about the identification of all these images of women with only one specific person or goddess and so on. In medieval textual sources, like I alluded to before, there are various persons mentioned carrying drinking horns. At feasts and gatherings, the chieftain's wife would offer meat and other beverages to the members of the retinue and war bands. This was a ritual known in almost all Germanic areas as a symbol of respect and reciprocity. And this little thing here, the man from Uppåkra, he's seen from the side. He's standing on some kind of platform that continues upwards in front of him. His clothes are rendered in great detail. He wears knee-length baggy trousers, belt, shoes, as was the fashion among rich men in the Baltic area and generally in the eastern area during the Viking Age. And in his hand, he appears to be holding a drinking horn as well. The pattern of his clothes are enhanced by engraved lines and gold inlays. However, his head is very unclear and worn. There is an extension from the chin, as you can see, and maybe that would be his beard or a mask and so on. So in these iconographic sources, we can notice the well-kempt hair and beards, but a little bit far away from what the series Vikings has proposed to us in matter of hairstyles. Speaking of hair, combs are objects offering us a wealth of information about the Viking Age, as combs were commonly used objects in Scandinavia, indicating the significance of grooming and cleanliness during the Viking Age. Despite their everyday nature, combs held value and were not easily discarded when teeth broke up or when they suffered damage. Interestingly, combs also served as a means of networking. Combs required lots of effort and expense. They were typical across Germanic Europe from the 4th, 5th century, and they required specialist materials, toolkits, skills. So you could ask yourself the question, why invest so many days in making such an object? They were not throwaway items, and they were not really private either, but on display to show off the craftsmanship, and they formed part of the grave goods along weapons and jewelry. The discovery of combs across a vast area spanning from Staraya Ladoga in Russia to Dublin in Ireland reveals a strikingly similar evolution in their design and ornamentation. This serves as proof of the close connections and interactions between these regions. They show intricate carvings, identifiable like the Frisian types, with one side being carved, so a message about how they should have been seen. They were commissioned, they could be gifts, and gradually more mass-produced for the market and not only restricted to the elite. So by the end of the Viking Age, probably everyone had one. It would have been an investment in social capital and appearance, in other words. Combs are not the same though. There are typologies based on similarities in shape and details, range of designs, but that can be translated a little better in other environments like metalwork. More importantly, you can figure out more by the way the object is made, the tools that are used, the pieces that are combined, riveted together with variation in the type of rivets or where they are placed. And even more important is the raw material. Usually deer. You do have some postcranial bones of sheep and cattle in England, but generally deer, like red deer or elk or reindeer. Initially, the production of combs was primarily for personal use. However, as time passed, it evolved into a system of travel. The development of comb production before urbanization can be divided into some phases. So in the first phase, you can say that involves producing combs for personal use. But then again, in the coming phases, comb makers would travel between different markets during a specific period. Similar to other craftsmen, they would visit locations where regular markets were held, ensuring a customer base. And these markets were likely held annually at fixed times, possibly coinciding with the meetings at the Thing gathering. What makes this craft particularly interesting is the wide range of products made from antler and bone. In addition to combs, craftsmen produced items like needles, decorated spindle whorls, gaming pieces, or dice. And archaeological evidence reveals smaller piles of waste from bone workers, indicating this type of production. In a last phase, we can say that would be characterized by a continuous production process concentrated in a permanent workshop, specializing in a narrow range of products. Archaeologically, this is evident through fewer but larger piles of waste, and to provide a clearer understanding of the quality and significance of these objects, I can present to you two recent examples. Suffolk could serve as a prime example. The significance of combs is highlighted in the recent release of findings from 2 decades of excavations in Ipswich. The variety of artifacts is notably extensive, particularly in terms of Viking relics, surpassing all other English locations in terms of both quality and quantity. Of special note is the collection of Viking combs, unparalleled in any other part of the country. These combs were crafted in Scandinavia, pointing to the presence of Vikings in Ipswich during the late 9th century. While combs were also manufactured locally, featuring regional styles and connections to the continent, it is this specific craftsmanship that implies that the town held a significant position during the early medieval period. The collection is primarily composed of artifacts from red deer antler fragments with a smaller amount of bone materials such as whale. In addition to combs, there are various items like brooch molds, pins, strap ends, weaving tools, textile making equipment, gaming pieces, and so on. It is believed that while the majority of combs were produced here in Ipswich, there are also imports from the Merovingian, Frisian, and of course Viking regions, with the closest connections appearing to be Dodderstad and Hedeby. Analyzing combs has come a long way in the past 10 years, and now we do have a method that is more precise in determining the origin of the material, and that method is zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry. This means identifying difference between collagen sequences, so populations of animals where the antler would have originated. And you can run lots of samples on it and identify the material using just a speck of the object, like the object would be drilled a little bit, and then you can analyze the material. And it has more advantages than the DNA testing, for example, which is also a newer method, but ancient DNA can prove to be very problematic and unstable, and also more expensive. So, for example, one conclusion that was drawn based on comb analysis was that referring to the contact between northern Scotland and Norway. Pictish combs, identified as made of reindeer antler initially, pointed out to a potential contact to Scandinavia. For example, you can go from Shetland Islands to Norway and the other way around. But the newest research actually shows pre-Viking combs were red deer, and the traditional Viking types came back from the analysis as reindeer. So, as you can see, a lot of interesting information to be drawn from such analysis. We do have an article on Hedeby from last year pointing out something fascinating as well. Out of the 49 samples analyzed, 44, so that would mean 90%, were determined to be reindeer, with 42 certain identifications and 2 probable, and the remaining samples consisted of 4 identified as bovidae and 1 sample not identified. The prevalence of reindeer antler as the primary material used in the production of these combs highlights the extensive interaction between Hedeby and the Scandinavian north, where reindeer herds were present. According to Kalmar's typology from 2020, reindeer antler was the predominant material used for combs throughout the 9th century. The earliest group examined included 10 examples of the supposedly Frisian type 26C, of which 9 were positively identified as being made of reindeer antler, and the remaining sample had insufficient data but was likely made of reindeer antler. To find out more about these different typologies and what they looked like, I linked to you 2 articles in the description. Research on combs from Hedeby reveals that a large majority of the type 5 combs, characterized by their large size, over 15 centimeters in length, and connecting plates with a planar convex profile, most examples featuring graduated teeth, were made from reindeer antler, indicating the widespread use of imported materials during the early Viking Age. Previous studies on wet zones have shown Hedeby's ties to upland Scandinavia, while recent genetic analysis has confirmed the importation of cod from Arctic waters to the town. These findings suggest that products from northern Scandinavia made their way to Hedeby, indicating a significant trade network to the south. The first century of Hedeby's existence saw the use of combs from northern Scandinavia, either from imports or brought by travelers or migrants, visitors from abroad generally, before the production of new forms using local materials began in the 10th century. Heatherby's integration into long-range networks of travel and trade, extending to the upland areas of central and northern Norway and Sweden, is thus well established. The exact nature of this trade, whether direct or facilitated through towns like Ribe or Kaupang, remains a little bit uncertain. However, these new findings reaffirm the notion put forth a couple of years earlier that activities and individuals in the northern regions of Scandinavia were very much connected to the urban networks linking Ribe or Hedeby. In Ribe, there are actually finds from the 8th century, like combs from northern Scandinavia, again proving contacts before the Viking Age. So an urban network was starting to form. And interestingly, while it was expected that some goods were imported from the north, evidence reveals a clear pattern. Despite Hedeby having the largest accumulation of comb-making waste in the Viking world, the majority of combs from the earlier phases were likely not produced on site. But then, as the Viking Age progresses, with all the raiding and traveling going on, there is also a spike in imported raw material, and then they start making their own combs. So this is interesting for us because it is further evidence that the Viking Age did not come out of the blue, but that movement and trade expanded in the 8th century, but then they were based on these earlier contacts. So as you can see, an object as mundane as a comb can also offer a great deal of information about history and about people, of course, about their movements and how they evolved over time. As usual, if you enjoy this topic, subscribe for more similar content. This was Irina, historian specializing in Norse history and culture. Till next time, and may the gods work in your favor.